March 9th, 1945. The night sky over Tokyo was about to turn into hell. 20-year-old Charles Buchinsky sat in the cramped tailgun position of AB-29 Superfortress, 7,000 feet above the Pacific Ocean. He was cold, exhausted, and terrified. Through the curved plexiglass bubble that surrounded him, he could see dozens of other B-29 bombers in formation, all headed toward the same target. In a few hours, they would drop 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo, creating a firestorm that would kill over 100,000 people in a single night. Charles would watch the city burn from his isolated perch at the back of the plane, and what he witnessed that night would stay with him for the rest of his life. This is the story Charles Bronson never told. The story Hollywood never wanted to hear. The story of how a coal miner's son from Pennsylvania became part of one of the most devastating bombing campaigns in human history, and how those missions over Japan changed him in ways he could never escape. Most people know Charles Bronson as Hollywood's toughest action star, the man with the granite face who never showed fear, never showed weakness, never broke. But before he was Charles Bronson, before he was even an actor, he was Private Charles Buchinsky of the United States Army Air Forces. And the things he saw during World War II, the things he did, they created a man who would later become famous for playing cold, silent, dangerous characters. Because Charles Bronson wasn't acting. He was remembering. December 7th, 1941, Pearl Harbor. Charles Buchinsky was 20 years old, working in the coal mines of Pennsylvania. When news of the attack reached his small mining town, Charles made a decision that would change his life forever. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces. For most young men, enlisting was an act of patriotism, a duty to defend their country. For Charles, it was something else. It was an escape from the coal mines that had killed his father, escape from a life of poverty with no future, escape from a world that had given him nothing but hardship. Since the day he was born, the Army sent Charles to Kingman, Arizona for gunnery training. They needed men who could handle the physical and psychological pressure of sitting in a gun turret thousands of feet in the air, surrounded by flak and enemy fighters, with nothing between them and death but a thin sheet of plexiglass. Charles was perfect for the job. He'd spent his childhood in claustrophobic coal mine tunnels. He'd learned to control fear in environments where panic meant death. He didn't flinch. He didn't freeze. He just did what needed to be done. After training, Charles was assigned to the 760th Flexible Gunnery Squadron, part of the 461st Bombardment Group. His job, tail gunner on AB-29 Superfortress. The tail gunner sat alone at the very back of the aircraft in a cramped, isolated bubble. It was one of the most dangerous positions on the plane. If enemy fighters attacked from behind, the tail gunner was the last line of defense. If the plane was hit, the tail gunner was often the first to die. If the aircraft went down, the tail gunner had the hardest time escaping. But the position paid an extra $50 a month. And for Charles Buchinsky, who had grown up with nothing, $50 extra was worth the risk. The B-29 Superfortress was a marvel of engineering. It was the most advanced bomber in the world, capable of flying higher and farther than any aircraft before it. It had pressurized cabins, remote-control gun turrets, and could carry up to 20,000 pounds of bombs. The plane was designed for one purpose: to destroy Japan's industrial capacity and break the will of the Japanese people to continue fighting. And Charles Buchinsky was part of the crew that would carry out that mission. In late 1944, Charles's squadron was deployed to Guam in the Mariana Islands. From there, they would fly bombing missions over Japan. The flights were long, brutal, over 3,000 miles round trip, taking 14 to 16 hours. The planes flew at high altitude to avoid anti-aircraft fire, but that meant temperatures in the gun turrets dropped to minus 40 degrees. Charles wore heated flight suits, but they often malfunctioned. He would sit in that tail gun position for hours, his hands numb with cold, his breath fogging the plexiglass, staring into the darkness, waiting for enemy fighters that might or might not come. The first few missions were industrial targets: factories, shipyards, military installations. Charles watched bombs fall from the planes ahead of him, saw explosions bloom below like flowers of fire. It was abstract distant. From 25,000 feet, a city looked like a map, not a place where people lived. It was easier that way. Easier to think of it as just a job, just following orders, just part of the war effort. But that changed on March 9th, 1945. That was the night everything became real. The mission briefing was different that day. Instead of high-altitude precision bombing, they were going in low, just 7,000 feet. Instead of high-explosive bombs, they were carrying incendiaries, M69 cluster bombs filled with napalm, designed to start fires that couldn't be extinguished. The target wasn't a factory or a military base. It was Tokyo itself. 16 square miles of densely populated residential neighborhoods. The briefing officer explained the strategy: create a firestorm that would overwhelm the city's ability to respond. Destroy Japan's capacity to produce war materials by destroying the workers' homes. Break their will to fight. Charles sat in that briefing room and understood exactly what they were being asked to do. They weren't attacking soldiers. They weren't destroying weapons. They were going to burn a city full of civilians, women, children, old people. The officer said it was necessary, that it would save American lives by shortening the war, that the Japanese would never surrender otherwise. Charles believed him, or maybe he just needed to believe him, because the alternative was accepting that he was about to participate in mass murder. That night, 334B, 29 bombers took off from bases in the Mariana Islands. Charles sat in his tailgun position as his plane climbed into the night sky. The formation was massive, the largest bombing raid in history up to that point. As they approached Japan, Charles could see the other bombers stretched out in every direction, their exhaust trails glowing faintly in the moonlight. Below, the ocean was black and endless, and ahead, Tokyo waited. The first bombs fell at 12:15 a.m. Charles watched through his gun sight as the lead bombers dropped their payloads. The M69 cluster split open in midair, releasing dozens of smaller bomblets that ignited on impact. Within minutes, hundreds of fires sprang up across the city. The wind that night was strong. Over 40 miles per hour, it fanned the flames. The fires began to merge, growing larger, hotter, feeding on the wooden structures that made up most of Tokyo's buildings. As Charles's plane made its bombing run, he could see the firestorm developing below. The temperature on the ground was reaching 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The heat was so intense it created its own weather system, generating winds that pulled oxygen toward the flames, making them burn even hotter. People below were suffocating from lack of oxygen even before the flames reached them. Others were boiled alive in canals where they'd sought refuge, the water turning to steam from the heat. From 7,000 feet, Charles could see it all. The fires, the smoke rising in massive columns, the city transforming into an inferno that looked like a vision of hell. The heat from the firestorm was so intense that it created updraft that buffeted the bombers, making the planes shake and lurch. The smell of burning flesh and wood filtered into the aircraft through the ventilation systems. Charles sat in his gun turret, watching, unable to look away, unable to process what he was seeing. The bombing run lasted for 2.5 hours. Wave after wave of B-29s dropped their incendiary bombs, adding fuel to the firestorm. By the time the last bomber turned for home, 16 square miles of Tokyo had been reduced to ash. Over 100,000 people were dead. More than 1 million were homeless. It was the single deadliest air raid in human history, more destructive than either of the atomic bombs that would be dropped later that year. On the flight back to Guam, Charles's plane was silent. The crew didn't celebrate. They didn't talk about the mission. They just flew in the darkness, each man alone with his thoughts. Charles stared out the night sky and tried to understand what he had just been part of. He tried to tell himself it was necessary, that it was war, that the people below had supported their government's aggression, that this would save American lives. But he kept seeing the fires, the massive scale of destruction, the knowledge that tens of thousands of people had just died because he and his crew had dropped bombs on them. That wasn't the last mission. Charles flew dozens more bombing raids over Japan through the spring and summer of 1945. Tokyo, Osaka, Kobe, Nagoya, city after city, Hundreds of thousands of tons of incendiary bombs. Millions of people displaced. Hundreds of thousands dead. The strategy was called strategic bombing, but there was nothing strategic about it. It was total war. The complete destruction of Japan's ability to fight by destroying not just military targets, but the industrial capacity, the infrastructure, the workforce, and the civilian population's will to continue. In August 1945, Charles' squadron supported the missions that dropped atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Charles wasn't on those specific flights, but he was part of the air operations that surrounded them. He saw the reconnaissance photos. He heard the reports. He understood that what he had witnessed over Tokyo was just a preview. The atomic bombs did in seconds what took hours with incendiary bombs, but the result was the same. Entire cities erased, tens of thousands dead, a level of destruction that defied comprehension. On August 15, 1945, Japan surrendered. The war was over. Charles Buchinsky had survived. He was 23 years old. He had flown over 30 combat missions. He had been part of the most devastating bombing campaign in human history, and he had absolutely no idea how to process any of it. The military didn't have PTSD counseling in 1945. There was no therapy, no support groups, no acknowledgement that watching cities burn and knowing you helped kill thousands of people might have psychological consequences. Soldiers were just expected to come home, move on with their lives, and never talk about what they'd seen or done. Charles returned to Pennsylvania in late 1945. He tried to go back to normal life, but there was no normal anymore. He couldn't sleep. When he closed his eyes, he saw fires. He heard the sound of bombs falling, the roar of the engines, the buffeting of the plane, and the updrafts created by firestorms. He woke up in cold sweats, disoriented, not knowing where he was. He started drinking to numb the memories, but that only made things worse. Friends and family asked him about the war. What was it like? They'd say, "Did you shoot down any enemy planes? Were you a hero?" Charles would just shake his head and change the subject. How could he explain? How could he tell them that he'd watched cities burn, that he'd been part of killing more people than he could count, that he still didn't know if it had been necessary or justified, or just a war crime dressed up in the language of military necessity? For years, Charles drifted. He worked construction jobs, hauled bricks, did anything that kept him busy and too tired to think. But the memories didn't fade. They just settled deeper, becoming part of who he was. The war had taken the boy from the coal mines and turned him into something else, something harder, something that understood violence and death in a way that most people never would. When Charles eventually became an actor, those experiences shaped everything he did on screen. The characters he played, the quiet intensity, the sense that violence was always just beneath the surface, that wasn't acting. That was Charles carrying the weight of what he'd seen and done in the war. Directors loved working with him because he brought a reality to roles that other actors couldn't fake. He didn't need to pretend to be a man who had seen terrible things. He was that man. But Charles never talked about the war publicly. In hundreds of interviews over his 50-year career, he almost never mentioned his service. When reporters asked, he would give short, vague answers. "I was a tail gunner. I flew missions over Japan. It was a long time ago." That was it. He never went into detail. He never told war stories. He never tried to use his service for publicity or to boost his image. The war was something private, something painful, something he carried alone. Only once, in a 1985 interview late in his life, did Charles come close to opening up. The interviewer asked if his war experience influences acting. Charles was quiet for a long moment, then said, "I saw things during the war that I wish I hadn't seen. Things that made me understand how fragile everything is, how quickly life can end, how much destruction human beings are capable of. That changes you. You can't unsee it. You can't unfeel it." So yes, it influenced my acting. It influenced everything. The interviewer pressed him. "What specifically did you see?" Charles's face hardened. "I saw what war really is. Not the movies, not the glory, just the burning and the dying and the knowing that you were part of it." He paused. And that's all I'm going to say about it. Charles Bronson lived with those memories for 58 years after the war ended. He never sought recognition for his service. He never attended veteran reunions. He never joined veteran organizations. He just carried it, quietly, the way he carried everything else in his life. When people praise him for being tough, for being unbreakable, Charles would sometimes think about those bombing missions over Japan, about sitting in that tail gun position, watching cities burn, knowing that below were people just trying to survive, just like he had been trying to survive in the coal mines. And he wondered if what people saw as toughness was really just the scar tissue that forms over trauma, the hard shell you develop when you've seen too much and felt too much and don't know how to let any of it out. On August 30th, 2003, Charles Bronson died. Among his possessions was a locked box that his family found after his death. Inside were his military records, his flight logs, and a handwritten journal he had kept during the war. The entries were sparse, factual, mostly just dates and targets. But on March 10th, 1945, the day after the Tokyo firebombing, there was one line: "I will never forget what I saw last night. God forgive us." Charles Bronson's war service is part of a larger story about the men who fought in World War II. They did things that were necessary to win the war, but those things came with a cost, a psychological cost that many of them carried for the rest of their lives. The generation that came home from World War II was called the greatest generation, and they saved the world from fascism. But that greatness came with scars, with trauma, with memories that didn't fade. Charles never called himself a hero. He rejected that label completely. In his mind, he was just a kid from the coal mines who did what he was told, who survived when others didn't, and who spent the rest of his life trying to make sense of it all. The bombing campaigns over Japan killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. They helped end the war. Both things are true. And Charles Bronson had to live with that contradiction, that moral complexity, for the rest of his life. If you watch Charles Bronson's films knowing this history, you see his performances differently. The quiet intensity, the reluctance to use violence even though he's capable of it, the sense that his characters have seen too much and lost too much. That wasn't acting. That was Charles processing his own experience, his own trauma, his own understanding that violence, even justified violence, leaves marks on the people who carry it out. The story of Charles Bronson in World War II is a reminder that war doesn't end when the shooting stops. It continues in the minds and hearts of the people who fought. Charles came home from the war in 1945, but part of him never left that tail gun position over Tokyo. Part of him was always sitting in that plexiglass bubble, watching fire spread, knowing that he was part of something terrible and necessary and unforgivable all at the same time. He carried that weight for 58 years, and he never put it down.